Hi everyone, and welcome back to our channel. In this particular video we will be discussing about VMware NSX-T version, especially the 3.0 which VMware released for a couple of weeks by now. We are very excited for hosting this video and for doing an installation of the VMware NSX. This new version has tons of functionality. We have already experience with the 2.4 version and the 2.5 version, but the 3.0, we've done some installation so far. It's very easy and some of the features are wonderful right out of the box. Now, if you haven't heard the news or you want to read more about the new functionality in the Nsx-T 3.0 version, I strongly suggest watching or accessing the vmware.com website. In our particular case, some of the functionality that we are interested is the enhanced security, especially on the distributed IDS/IPS functionality, and also the support for vSphere with Kubernetes. So these are actually some of the features that we were looking when trying to install the Nsx-T 3.0. Now, this installation is long, and for this particular installation I prepared a wonder list. I wanted to see exactly how to map this installation from top to bottom and mapped a couple of steps that we'll be doing in this deployment. So the step number one that we'll be using is you need to download all the images you need or have access to the images that VMware offers to their customers and partners. Now, images like VMware Vcenter server or VMware EXI, the OVA for the Nsx Manager, the Identity Manager if you're planning to deploy it, the Nsx Intelligence Appliance, of course, if you're trying to install that one as well. So you need to gather all the resources, images and or disks that you will be using through the labs. In my scenario, I've already downloaded everything regarding Nsx-T 3.0 and added them to a folder so I can keep them in hand in case I will need them later. Now, big thumbs up for William Lamb, which is a senior staff solution architect at VMware. He is kind enough through the website to share some very good knowledge. A virtual ghetto, highly suggest this particular website. What he is actually helping the VMware community is by offering EXI virtual appliances. So you're actually saving good minutes of your time by just deploying, if you're on a nested infrastructure, of course, in a lab, the nested EXI OVAs rather than downloading from the VMware website an ISO and creating the hypervisor from scratch. In our example, we have used the latest version, which is the EXI 7.0 virtual appliance. It's very easy to install. If you're running a nested infrastructure, just download the OVA, import on one of your hosts, do some minor configuration like create a host name, an IP address, some network settings, and after that you are good to go. So downloading everything you need is the first step that you'll need to do. Also, you need to gather some resources. Now, you will need to understand that VMware NSX-T, either in a production or even in a nested lab running under a bare metal EXI whatever version or running on your laptop nested under VMware Workstation, will require tons of resources. We have gathered just a few resources. So going with the extra mall configuration for the Nsx Manager, going with the tiny version of the VMware Vcenter server, plus the 2 EXI hosts, plus the Identity Manager, you will need tons of horsepower, either CPU, RAM, and also this from the data store to host all those appliances. Just to give you some numbers, the VMware Nsx-T Manager in the extra small configuration will require 2 virtual CPUs, 8 GB of RAM and 300 GB from the storage, and also a VMware vSphere 5.5 or greater version. While going down the scale on a small setup, of course the resources are more in terms of vCPU and also RAM. So for our scenario, we'll go with the extra small configuration for the Nsx-T Manager, along with the tiny version or deployment for the VMware Vcenter server. In the tiny configuration, the VMware Vcenter server will require 2 virtual CPUs, 12 GB of RAM, almost half of terabyte of storage, and under this configuration the VMware Vcenter server will support up to 10 hosts and 100 virtual machines. For each of the EXI hosts will be assigning 4 vCPUs, 16 GB of RAM, 250 gigs from the storage, and we'll create each EXI host with 4 virtual NICs. Just bear in mind that 16 gigs of RAM is probably the minimum requirement for being able to install NSX. We've tried some installation with on an EXI host with 8 gigs of RAM, and during the installation steps for the NSX host transport, we've got some error messages that the RAM assigned to the EXI host is too little. So I presume 16 or something more than 8 gig of RAM to an EXI host running nested would be the hotspot for assigning to the EXI host. Now, VMware Identity Manager, it's also something that you should plan installing. It doesn't have a lot of resources, so 2 virtual CPUs and 6 GB of RAM alongside with 60 GB of storage. And also, if you need more cleverness, we strongly suggest looking at the Nsx Intelligence appliance. Now, this is very resource hungry in terms of specs. Under the small configuration, it will require 16 virtual CPUs and 64 gigs of RAM and 2 TB of storage. In our particular video, we'll be skipping this Nsx Intelligence. Even though we have the horsepower in terms of vCPU and RAM, we won't have enough storage to assign to this particular appliance, and we don't plan to install it even in the thin provisioning for the storage. If you're going down the scale with a large, which most likely VMware recommends, you will be looking at 32 vCPUs and 128 GB of RAM and the same 2 TB of storage. So we'll be going most likely later with a small setup for the Nsx Intelligence. So this will be the minimum specs that will be running to the Nsx-T lab. Now, I'm not suggesting that assigning less vCPUs or gigs of RAM to the Nsx Manager and the VMware Vcenter server will not work. We've run Vcenter server and the Nsx Manager with less gigs of RAM, but you need to be very patient. There are a couple of services that will start or will work very slow. Now, we already discussed about the image download, the resources. The next step that you'll have to do is to import all of the appliances that you need in your lab. And for this particular example, we have set up our host, which is running an HP DL360 Gen 8 server with a dual socket CPU from Intel, Ivy Bridge generation, and 96 GB of RAM. This will give us enough horsepower to run all the appliances nested here. Now, going with in the VMware vSphere console, the first option that we'll have to do is to deploy all the appliances. Of course, go into the our download folder, and in my particular example, I will start first with the nested DXi 7.0. Now, I'll only do one, and after that I will skip and resume once this import for the EXI host is finished. I will also give it a name. In my particular example, I will go with lab-nsx T exi01.sa.lab and hit next, and you'll definitely understand why downloading this OVA from Virtual Ghetto website is a cool thing. It's just saving you tons of time rather than doing a clean installation of a EXI host. Right now I have selected my data store, I've selected my host, click next. I also accept the license agreement. Just bear in mind that VMware will not offer support for this. I will also select the data store where this particular virtual machine will reside. We'll go with the thin provisioning, so nothing is high priority. I've also created the switch. In my particular example, it's called Nsx-V switch. And here we'll need to do some configuration. The host name for this machine would be lab-nsx-t exe01.sa.lab. The IP address that I will provision for this one will be 10.10.0.111. The net mask is 255. If I can click here, 255.255.255.0. I have fat fingers today. And the gateway, it will be 10.10.0.1. I don't have any VLAN IDs. The DNS server in my example, 10.10.0.30. The DNS domain is sa.lab. And also I need to remove the syslog server, and I also need to change the password. The default password for this particular appliance is VMware1 ! With capital VM. Now of course I will put a different password, and that's cool. I can also disable SSH. I don't need particular SSH as a service to be enabled, and I don't need to create a data store one. Hit next and also finish. Now we'll start deploying this particular image. Again, I will pause this video and resume once I have both EXI hosts deployed. I will follow again the same procedure on the EXI number 2. Great. Now both EXI hosts are deployed. Let's try to do some configuration on them. Being in a nested infrastructure, you will need to edit some settings, and you will need to make sure that the CPU is having this option enabled here, the expose hardware assisted virtualization to the guest OS. This needs to be enabled. I will also bump the cores per socket. In my particular example, I will go with 4, and I will also attach a new hard disk. So under the add new device, we'll select the first option, which is called the hard disk. I will give it 250 gigs of RAM, and of course I will enable again thin provisioning. And furthermore, I will give another 2 network adapters. So I've selected one and the second one. So your switch should have again a decent number of CPU cores. You need to make sure that the hardware virtualization extensions are enabled. You need to make sure that you have enough disk. In my example, I've selected 250, that will be for the data store, and you have enough network adapters attached. All adapters are actually pointing to that switch, and also all adapters are having the VMXnet 3 version as an adapter type. We'll also go the same. We'll also configure the same. We'll do the same configuration for the EXI02. So selecting 4 cores or 4 sockets. Hardware extensions are also enabled. We'll also attach another 250 hard disk, and we'll select this option here. And thin provisioning for this one, and we'll also enable 2 network adapters. And all network adapters are actually pointed to the Nsx-V switch. Now we should have all the correct settings, save, and we'll also power on both of the EXI hosts. Now of course you can also open a console to them. And I like the new version, the new view of the VMware Vcenter server 7.0. It gives you more information right on the console, and it looks very nice and clean and intuitive. You can see tons of information directly from this page. Now the EXI01 is trying to power on. Once this virtual machine is started, we will also be able to connect to it directly from the browser. Now going back to the to-do list, so we've downloaded the machines, we've looked at the resources. Let's highlight the resources that will stay. So we'll go with the extra small configuration for the Nsx Manager. We'll also go with the tiny version of the VMware Vcenter server, and also we'll skip the Nsx Intelligence, and we'll still keep the VMware Identity Manager. So this should be the hardware specs that our lab will be having. Extra small for Nsx Manager, tiny for VMware Vcenter server, and also the specs for both of the EXI01 and EXI02 hosts. Now, the next step that we'll need to do is install VMware Vcenter server. Now, to install VMware Vcenter server, of course, you need to download that ISO image directly from the VMware website. You need to mount it, and you need to go to vscca-ui installer, run the Windows 32 folder, and execute that installer.exe application. This installation page is showing now, and it will give us the steps for installing a new VMware vCenter server that will be used for the Nsx-T 3.0. Now, I will be pausing this video right now and resume after this server is installed. We've already done this installation and save it on YouTube, so if you want to go check how the vCenter server is deployed, feel free to look at that clip. Great, so VMware vCenter server just finished. This actually took a while, and let's try to access now the console. Okay, so we'll launch the VMware vSphere client, HTML5. We'll connect with the credentials that we just generated. Okay, so the console eventually loaded. This is actually the interface for the VMware vCenter Server 7.0. What we'll have to create now is create a data center, create a cluster, and also add the two EXI hosts that we previously deployed. So let's try to create the first data center. We'll right click, create a data center. We'll give it a name, Nsx-T data center. We'll hit OK. Now the data center is actually created. We also need to create a cluster. So new cluster, we'll put a name, lab cluster. We'll also enable DRS and HA. Now we need to skip this manage all hosts in a cluster with a single image. This is not something that it's officially supported yet in the Nsx-T 3.0 version. So we'll skip that one. We now created the cluster, and also we need to add the hosts. So right click the cluster, hit add. We'll add the IP addresses lab-nsxt exi01.nsx.lab and username, root, and the password. Okay, so we've added two. We've added the username and the passwords. Let's hit next. We'll also accept the thumbprint certificate. Hit OK. Wait for this page to load. Apparently some of the credentials are not okay, so the lab02. Okay, we'll add the first one then. First one is okay. 7.0, the EXI version finish. And let's try to add again the second EXI. Probably we had a typo. Accept again the certificate. Hit next. Yes, it was a typo. Hit finish. And let's check what's happening now. So the host is actually added to that lab cluster. It also got migrated. Both are in maintenance mode, and now we'll start with some quick start regarding the cluster. So DRS and HA are enabled, and hit configure the cluster. We need to configure the network settings for vMotion and traffic. Actually, before doing that, let's try to click the host, go to configuration, and let's try to create the virtual switch. Let's add the second adapter. So add physical adapter, and we'll go to the vSwitch 0, yes, the plus, and we'll move adapter 3 to the standby, so it needs to look like this. Bear in mind that we have 4 virtual NICs per EXI host. We've created 2 adapters being active and 2 in standby for the vSwitch configuration. We'll go the same on the EXI number 2. So under the configuration, configure tab, networking virtual switches, manage physical adapters, hit the plus, and we'll select 1 as being active and number 2 and 3 as being in standby. Okay, and now we should have, well, this should be in standby, yeah. You know what, we'll select them as unused. I think we'll need them later. Great, so now we have 2 virtual NICs added to this, added to switches, to vSwitch switches, unused, okay. And we'll also need to create a data store. So if we're going here to the data store, Nsx-T data center, storage, new data store, we'll create a VMFS data store. We'll give it the name local-exi01, and we'll select the host, which is the first one. We'll also select the capacity, the 250 gigs disk that we attached. We'll also select VMFS 5, and we'll use all the storage available in this disk, and hit next. And now we'll create another data store. So right click the data center, storage, new data store, same functionality, VMFS. We'll put a name local-exi02. Under the host, we'll select the second EXI host, same, we'll select that 250 gig disk, VMFS 6, everything that the disk has, and hit finish. So right now we have 2 local data stores, 1 per host, each is having a 250 gig capacity. Now if we are going back to the DRS cluster, lab cluster, and configure the cluster, now we'll also create a distributed switch, and I will name this one Nsx-D switch, and we'll use adapter 0 as follows. So adapter 0, which is VMNIC 0, will point to the Nsx-D switch, and same applies for the adapter 1. So we'll have 2 uplinks, and hit next. We'll not use any VLANs, and here we'll go with some static IP addresses. This will be the IP addresses used for vMotion. So I have some IP addresses here, 10.0.121, and the second one will have 10.0.122. And hit next, and we'll go with fully automated, which is absolutely fine. and hit next again and hit finish. Now let's wait for this configuration to finish, and after that we'll have a fully supported cluster for the Nsx-T 3.0 version. Great, so the cluster just finished, and the next step that we'll have to do is to deploy that Nsx Manager. So let's go back to our to-do list. So we've provisioned the resources extra small for the Nsx Manager 3.0, tiny configuration for the Vcenter server. We've already provisioned the resources per EXI host, and next in terms of machine is to deploy this Nsx Manager 3.0. So let's do the import now. Right click the folder or the host, deploy OVF template. In my particular case it is a local file which points to this appliance over here. That's the name of the OVA. Hit next. I will also give it another name, lab-nsxt manager.sa.lab, and hit next. We'll also select the data store, hit next, and now we'll have to provision some information like hostname, IP addresses, so we'll go with the extra small configuration, again 2 vCPUs and 8 GB of RAM, 300 GB storage. Next again, we'll use this data store, theme provisioning to save some space. Under the NAT I've created another switch. We'll give it a manual IP address, and the password for this one, it needs to be complex. Okay, so this will be the admin password, sorry, the root account password for the Nsx Manager. This will also be the admin password, so and of course the password do not match. This will be the audit password. CLI admin will still use admin. Audit username will still use audit. And under the host name we'll put lab-nsxt manager. The role will be Nsx Manager. You can also change the role as Global Manager or Cloud Services Manager. The site name it will be sa.lab. Okay, so we have the gateway, the management network IP address, the net mask, the NS server list, and also domain search list. And let's see what are their settings. These are the internal properties. We can hit next, finish. Now let's wait for this appliance to deploy and import. Okay, so we finished importing the Nsx Manager virtual machine. Now before doing any changes and hopping into the console for the Nsx Manager, I would like to discuss with you some functionality and configuration for the distributed switch that we just created. So going back to the VMware Vcenter server console, hitting the networking tab, and we have here the Nsx-D switch that we just created. Now by default we have created a 6.6 version of a switch. There are some upgrades available where we can upgrade to 7.0, and let's go to the action menu, and we have here the upgrade setting. And if we select the upgrade distributed switch, we can actually upgrade from the 6.6 version of a switch to a 7.0 version. Now this actually makes things and life much easier, because this particular switch will be managed directly from the Nsx Manager as well. So if we hit next, we're jumping from 6.6 to 7.0 and hit finish. Now we have a 7.0 version. Now we also need to change the MTU. So by default the MTU was created to 1500 bytes. Now Nsx-T supports anything from 1600 to more. So instead of running into any errors later, let's hit the advanced tab. Strongly suggest changing this MTU from 1600 to 9000. In our particular case, we'll select 9000 directly, hitting OK, and this is the policy. The setting has been saved. Now let's try to open the Nsx Manager page. So https lab-nsx manager nsx manager.lab. Now same applies as in the VMware Vcenter server case. Starting the first time, the manager or Vcenter is a bit slow. Now we'll try to connect with the credentials that we just provisioned, in my particular case the admin account. It's actually loaded. We have an end user license agreement and it's still slow. We'll understand and accept the terms, hit continue. We'll skip the VMware customer experience program and we will dismiss this note. Now this is actually the UI for the Nsx-T. Let me pause this one for a second. I want to manage the licenses, as under the trail key we'll have some limited functionality, and we'll resume in a few seconds. And we're back. Managed to fix the license issue, and the first thing that VMware will recommend is to create a 3-node cluster. Right now we only have one Nsx Manager. VMware for a high availability infrastructure, they recommend 3 for the time being, and having few resources available, we'll only use 1. But in a production infrastructure you will have to use the best practices and deploy 3 nodes for the Nsx Manager. Now if we get with the get started button, VMware offers a nice flow, and first we'll add the compute manager. Actually, let's switch back to the to-do list. So I just want to remove some things from our agenda. So we've went with the resources extra small tiny. VMware Identity Manager is not yet installed. We've already imported all the appliances. Under the miscellaneous items, we had to provision 5 IP addresses and also create DNS name records prior installing Vcenter server or Nsx Manager as best practices. We've already installed the VMware Vcenter server and created the cluster and the data center and added 2 nodes. And when we are looking at Nsx Installation Workflow, VMware offers 3 scenarios. The first scenario is the Nsx-T data center workflow for a vSphere infrastructure. This is also the scenario that we'll be using. They also offer a second scenario and workflow for KVM. And also the third one is configuration of Nsx Manager on bare metal servers. But for the time being, we'll only be using the workflow for VMware vSphere. Now if we expand this one, as you can see, we've added the workflow from the VMware website and the install guide. So look at system requirements, configure ports and protocol, install and log to the Nsx Manager, and the next step is actually configuring a compute manager. In our particular case, it will be the VMware Vcenter server. Now if we switch back to the VMware NSX Manager console, if we press the Add Compute Manager and hit Add, this is where we can specify the VMware Vcenter server, so VMware Vcenter server 7.0. Now the FQDN is lab-nsx-t vcenter.sa.lab. And also the password, hit add. We'll accept the thumbprint. And now our compute manager is successfully created. Now if you also refresh, which is down here, now the registration status is registered and we're just waiting for the connection status to be established. Let's wait for a few seconds. Great, the connection status is up and you can also see more information. Now if we go back to the home and look again at the system and the get started page, this is where we are actually focusing on the prepare NSX transport nodes. If we press the get started, we'll have a nice user wizard that we can actually use. Now select the node types. We'll use the host cluster. We'll not do each individual host separately. We'll use the host cluster and also hit the next button. Under the host cluster we can actually specify the VMware Vcenter server, which is the compute manager, and hit install. Now the installation is in progress. We'll resume this one once everything is finished. Okay, so we had a minor error on both hosts. One of the hosts was configured with less gigs of RAM. So let's try to redo again the installation. So from the configuration fabric nodes, you can also press the resolve. And we'll do the same for the second host. And we'll also hit refresh. And right now we're waiting for the NSX to install and to see if the installation finished successfully or not. Be back in a second. Okay, so this time the NSX agent is installed on both of the hosts. We'll select the lab cluster and hit the configure NSX button. We'll also create a transport node profile. We'll select the VDS and let's see if we select this one. No, we'll select the VDS, and under the vCenter we can select our vCenter server and also the switch. Under the transport node we can use the overlay transport zone. Under the IP assignment we'll use the ACP, and we'll also select uplink 1 and uplink 2 and hit add. Now we'll hit apply. Right now we're applying this profile. Great, and this task finished successfully. Now during this video we have covered the resources of the lab and also the workflow installation for the Nsx-T. So we've looked at the installer requirements. I will let you do your own investigation and learning on the ports and protocols. We have installed the Nsx Manager and logged in. We have configured the compute manager. We skipped the additional Nsx Manager to form a cluster due to lack of resources. By default VMware recommends 3. And also we created a transport zone and also created host transport nodes. Now for the time being we'll stop this recording. It's already like 50 minutes and we recorded for the last 3 hours. Go with editing, and we'll create a part 2 and part 3 on the NSX, especially focusing on different services, networking, and also security. Both topics are quite big, and also later we'll be looking at using the Nsx Identity Manager for connecting and authenticating to the NSX. Thank you, really appreciate for your support. Hit the thumbs up button or thumbs down if you don't like the video. Leave us some comments, let us know your own opinion or feedback. We really sure need your support. Thanks and see you next time. Bye.